Welcome to Santaroga Surplus. This is part 3 of the Ruger SP101 action job. Now, I did remove this at the end of the last video, the fire control group, the trigger group, but I went ahead and put it back in. Once again, I want to remind you that this is not the time or place to polish the outside of the revolver while you have things apart like this. These pieces are mated, they're machined, they're fit. If you do want to remove the crane arm and start to do some polishing or some weird stuff, there's ways to do it, but this is not the time or the project for that. So, moving back to where we were, you have to slide in the back, push this pin in. Okay, that pin is held in place with a cross pin, and the spring that is in there is your trigger return spring. So we'll be dealing with that after we get it out. Pin in, and then you're going to lift up on the trigger group and get it moving. And once again, that can be a daunting and difficult task. Okay, so we're going to use just a little bit of help. Once you push that retaining pin in, you can actually lock it in place if you push it hard enough. Remember that you're not going to pry anywhere around here. If you're going to do any prying, it's going to be all the way back here where there's no fitted surface. Okay? That is what you need to know right here. This is your transfer bar. It's going to be the first part we work with. This is your hand. I think there might be another name for it now. Cylinder stop, trigger, and there's a bunch of springs and stuff in here that we can lose. Let's move the firearm itself off to the side and start taking a look at this. So this pin right here is held in by this cross pin, and that's the spring for your trigger. Okay, trigger return spring. This is your transfer bar. Okay, and down here is your hand. The transfer bar is the first thing that we're actually going to do. And that is a pretty easy one. Pull the trigger slightly. Now, you don't want to pull the trigger back very far, or the pawl, the hand spring, will launch out. Okay? So you're going to very carefully pull the trigger back just enough that you can remove the transfer bar. Okay? Put it back. Practice this stuff, man. It's going to save you if you just do this a couple times, step by step. That is your transfer bar. That's it. Now, we're going to set this off to the side for just a moment and talk about the transfer bar. The transfer bar has a couple bearing surfaces that we're going to actually polish later on. Basically, right here where it rubs against the actual moving parts. Okay, that's about it. Now we're going to remove the pawl, the hand. Okay, and that has a spring. It's going to try to launch. This is where we break out a Ziploc bag and a... Can you see? Okay. I'm going to pull the trigger, and you can see the hand moves. I'll take that out a little bit. See the hand moves. All right. There's a spring that brings it back. Spring's in there. So once you pull the trigger back far enough, you can lift the hand, the little boot. Can you see the boot? And then There you go. Now you can see the pawl spring, the hand spring, sitting right there. Okay, it didn't launch all the way out, but it's another plunger and spring, and it sits right, let me get back in frame, little spring, and it sits right on that bearing surface, right there. Okay? That's part of the polishing. Now you can just pull the pawl, the hand spring, and plunger right out. There you go. At this point, I would usually just go ahead and polish the pieces, but we're going to complete our disassembly first this time. Let me pull back out a little bit here. Now we're going to remove the trigger guard latch. That's this part right here that we had to push in. Okay? And again, this is one of those things that's going to want to launch. But, let me get a smaller punch out. We're going to push it in with our thumb and push that retaining pin, start that retaining pin on its way out. And then here is, there's the pin, right? And here is the actual trigger guard latch. Now this, the fact that this doesn't want to come out is part of why we're taking it out. We want to polish that whole area inside. Okay, this is the retainer. This is the spring. This is your trigger return spring. There's another piece in there. Okay? It's a little cup. That is a very difficult piece. So we're going to kind of not worry about it right now, because once we pull the trigger out a little bit, we'll be able to actually get in there. This is a good time to talk about trigger shims. So once again, same thing we did before. If we have this right here, there's a wiggle. There's another side-to-side wiggle. Okay? So we're going to check our shims, and a 7 on this side barely fits. Okay, so we are stuck with 0.007 and 0.006. That's 0.013, and we will remember that number for later. Now we can remove the trigger itself. We're just going to push out the retaining pin right there. Now, if you need to see a better view of that, this is not a tight pin. As with most things on this pistol, it's not a tight pin. That's your trigger. You can see the pin that it sits on. Alright, we're just going to drop that pin right out. That is the trigger pin itself. Now, we're going to pull the trigger out. Trigger has a couple pieces in it. This piece here, this piece right here, is the piece that pushes back in this hole, okay, onto your, that's called the trigger link, Okay, that pushes into the trigger link connector here, which pushes on the spring, which pushes on that, which is retained by the pin. Okay, that's your trigger latch. Now we're going to get in here and we are going to get this thing out one way or another. So this one's really stuck, which means we really have a rough spot going on in this channel, which is one of the main things that people look at when they're doing an action job, is that this is a pretty rough hole. And that can have an effect on how your trigger spring actually travels, how smooth the travel is. In this case, we're not actually going to be able to get that out without a little bit of cleanup. Cleanup is with a 1/4 inch drill bit. Alright, so now we're going to clean this out just a little bit so that we can actually get the trigger link connector out of the hole. Now, this is a 1/4 inch milling bit instead of a 1/4 inch drill bit. The key element here is that you're doing this by hand. You're not using any power tools, and you can use a reamer to do the job just as well. In this case, there are actual metal shavings going on. This is a pretty roughly drilled hole. But there is the final piece out. Now we're going to, there is a lip on the end of this, the inside end of your trigger guard. So you don't want to actually punch through that, okay? All you're doing here is cleaning up the channel a little bit by your hand reaming it with a drill bit. Now, that is actually pretty much the only thing you're going to do to the trigger guard itself. Back to the trigger, because we're done with this for the moment. The trigger has a couple of things that we're going to actually polish. The plunger and the trigger itself. The plunger is a little part in here that is held by the trigger pin. So there's a little part right here, and I know you can't see this. Okay, I've got this going through. There's another piece right here. We're going to turn it over, and the back part of it is going to slide out. Now look at your orientation. Okay. Flat side faces the bottom of the trigger. Flat side faces the bottom of the trigger. Flat side faces the bottom of the trigger. Now this part here, your connector, is in with a what's considered to be a permanent pin. Okay, it's got a pattern here. It's a keyed pin. Now, I will probably polish that at some point. Polish it up just a little bit on the bearing surface, which is just the very end. And I'll show you how I do that later. The trigger itself, you can go to town on the trigger itself. This is a point where if you want to take edges off, you want to shape it a little bit, the only bearing that this has is your finger. So, don't kill yourself on it, but you can go ahead and shape this pretty reasonably. The sharp duckbill point on the plunger, remember, flat side of the plunger faces the bottom of the trigger. Now I'm going to come in a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. There we are. All right. Facing away from you, okay, towards the front of the trigger, there's a little duckbill right there. Okay? That point right there, okay, is where it contacts the cylinder latch. All you want to do is polish that just a little bit. Okay? Really, that's all there is with that. You just, on the top of the trigger, right here, this is where it meets with the hammer dog, okay? The top of the trigger cam. That is also polished. Don't remove stuff, don't change geometry, nothing like that, okay? So let's do that. All right, welcome back. So we have just polished the trigger. Okay, now remember, trigger plunger, flat part towards the bottom of the trigger, pointy part, duckbill, faces the front of the handgun. There you are. Now, I did a lot of polishing on the face of the trigger. Okay, I tend to do that. Jerry Michalek likes a grippy trigger and smooth grips. I kind of like the opposite right now, but I'm only 50 years old, so we'll ask me again when I'm like 70. Maybe I'll agree with him. We polish the engagement surface here at the top, where the hammer dog engages, and that's it. Now, where this trigger link hits is it hits right into the top, the indented surface here of the connector, and then you have the trigger spring. So when we reassemble, this is where we switch out another spring. But this is the part where I wanted to smooth this out a little bit, just so it moves a little easier. The next step is actually going to be the cylinder stop. All right. There's another spring for the cylinder stop. If you look carefully, you can see right there that little spring. The cylinder stop here does not have a pin that goes through that goes side to side. It comes off of a mounted rod. So what you're going to do is you're going to pull it off, keeping your finger over where the spring is. And then the spring is right there with its little pawl, or its little plunger. And we'll pull that out. That reminds me, needle nose pliers. I promised that I would show you how I polish the back of the trigger link, and then I didn't do it on camera. Basically, that's it right there. I hold it like that, and I just run the polishing wheel over it for a moment. It's not a big deal. It's completely optional part of the job. Every part of this job is actually optional. There's, you can go ahead and experiment and see what the real big deals are. Probably the hammer dog, the hammer strut, and the sear and hammer dog engagement surface on the trigger are like the biggest deals. But so this is the cylinder stop. Okay, this is the part that literally sticks up and stops the cylinder from rotating. Okay, so here is a place where you really don't want to mess things up. Just gonna polish it very, very lightly. Very, very lightly on the top. Okay, and then the plunger, the spring, this part right here. Let's come back in and take a look at it. Okay, that's the cylinder stop. That's the part that hits the cylinder. The top, not the sides, but the top. Polish very lightly. And then this part right here, where it hits the plunger, that side, that's the plunger spring. And then the other side here, this is the trigger plunger. Okay? So you're going to do both sides of this little tab, let's back that up. Okay, so before we do put the the cylinder stop back on, where the hand, okay, the cartridge, the cylinder rotator, the hand goes in to the trigger, all right, it bears on the trigger guard itself just a little bit right in here, okay? So we're going to go ahead right at the foot, the very front here, we're going to go ahead and polish that just a little bit. And this is one of those areas where I'm just going to use a stone. I'll move everything out of the way so I don't get grit everywhere. I'm just going to make sure it's a little smooth. Okay, you can't really get in here with a polishing wheel. All I'm doing is making sure that it's not rough. And with that, we're probably going to start putting it all back together.